Here comes the most challenging leg of the journey. I will embark on a trip from Jasper all the way to Field in BC because there's a DC fast charger there. If I cannot make it to Field, I will stop at Lake Louise, which is about 20 kilometers closer, and I will use the level 2 chargers there. I will show you how I plan for this leg of the trip and all the calculations I'm going to make. If you're not interested in hearing about the math, you can skip to the next timestamp. What I am calculating is, what is the worst consumption I can get before not being able to make it to my destination? And this specific consumption number is what I call the threshold consumption. I start with the total energy available in the Kona's battery. The highest trim level of the Kona, which is what I have, has a usable capacity of 64 kilowatt hours. To make my calculations more conservative, I will keep 10% battery as a buffer. And this is how I do it. 64 kilowatt hours multiplied by 0.9 equals 57.6 kilowatt hours. Let's just assume that 90% battery is actually just 57 kilowatt hours to be even more conservative. What this means is that we have 57 kilowatt hours of energy to use if we keep 10% of the battery as emergency energy reserve. The distance from Jasper to Lake Louise is 238 kilometers. The distance from Jasper to Field is 258 kilometers. Field is preferable because it has a 50 kilowatt DC fast charger. Lake Louise only has 7 kilowatt level 2 chargers. To calculate the threshold consumption, we divide the distance we have to cover by the energy we have available to us, which is 57 kilowatt hours. Let's calculate the threshold consumption to Lake Louise first. 238 kilometers divided by 57 kilowatt hour equals to 4.2 kilometers per kilowatt hour. If we have consumption that is worse than 4.2, then we cannot make it to Lake Louise. We can calculate for Field as well. Same equation, but different distance. 258 kilometers divided by 57 kilowatt hour gives us 4.5 kilometers per kilowatt hour. If we have a consumption that is worse than 4.5, we cannot make it to Field. These numbers can help us decide on what to do when we're actually driving. So after you've driven about 50 kilometers or more, your consumption numbers should stabilize and settle at a certain number, and this shouldn't fluctuate too much as you go further on your trip. If the consumption is worse than 4.2, then I need to turn back right away because I can't make it to Lake Louise. If the consumption falls in between 4.2 and 4.5, then I will go for Lake Louise. If my consumption happens to be better than 4.5, then I will go for Field. And plans can change as well, and the closer you get to your destination, the more accurate your consumption number is. So the ultimate decision of where to go to, Lake Louise or Field, will be made when I am about 20 kilometers away from Lake Louise. Now remember, this calculation takes into account of putting aside 10% of the battery capacity as emergency reserve. So if my consumption is exactly at 4.2, that means I should be able to arrive in Lake Louise without the battery going to zero. In planning for this challenging drive, I have 3 things in my favor. Number 1 is that I have already driven this route for 127 kilometers the day before. The consumption I got was 4.8, which is already better than what I need if we want to get to Field. The second thing is, according to the weather forecast, the temperature will rise somewhat on the day of the trip, so I should get even better consumption compared to the day before. And lastly, I have another trick up my sleeve to ensure that the trip starts with a battery that is not super cold. Now, I hinted at this during the intro to this series. The trick is to time your charging so that your vehicle charges to 100% right as you are about to leave on your long trip. So this is how I did it. I started with the battery at 61% and at -8 degrees. Given this battery's temperature, the battery heater will turn on when the charging is at high state of charge. I know that when the battery heater is pulling power from the charger, the net charging speed slows down, which means the total charging time is longer than usual. I plugged in the vehicle to see the predicted charging time. I find that the Kona's charging time prediction includes the time needed for battery heating. It says it needs 5 hours and 40 minutes. I will round it up to 6 hours. For the next morning, I plan to leave at around 10 a.m. This means that if the vehicle starts charging at 4 a.m., it will be fully charged at 10 a.m. I want to start charging at 3 a.m. because, just in case, I may want to leave a bit earlier. So even if the battery reaches 100% 1 hour prior to departure, it will cool down a little bit, but it will still stay way above the ambient temperature. So that's the setting I used to set up the scheduled charging. What I did was I plugged in the Kona, I left it, and at 3 a.m., boom, starts charging. I actually started a bit late the next morning, so I started my trip at around 11 a.m. Lo and behold, the battery is at 2.2 degrees, while the ambient temperature is minus 18. If I did not use this battery preheating trick, the battery would be at minus 18 degrees as well. There is actually a lot more nuance around this battery heating trick, especially at really low ambient temperatures. So this trick may not work for every single situation. I will explain my discoveries around this battery heating phenomenon in more detail in a separate video, so make sure you're subscribed for that. Just a word of warning, Highway 93 is a difficult road to drive in the wintertime. The road is twisty and slippery in a lot of places, and when the snowfall is very heavy, the road is not always cleared on time. And one very important thing to know is, for the entire highway, almost the entire highway, there is no cell signal. So when you're going to the south, you would not get any cell phone signal until you get to Trans-Canada Highway 1. So if you want to drive on Highway 93 in the winter, no matter what you're driving, EV or a internal combustion engine vehicle, you have to be extra prepared with extra food and water and extra warm clothing. I have decided that to ensure I arrive at field to use the DC fast charger, I will not use any cabin heating at all. The reason being that if I could get 4.8 kilometers per kilowatt hour of consumption with cabin heating, I will definitely get better consumption without it. I have the defroster blowing though, but with the heating off. I have the heated seats and the heated steering wheel to provide me with a little bit of warmth, and when I'm wearing all of this winter gear, I'm not actually feeling all that cold. The road is much like the previous time I drove it. I drove cautiously along and definitely was under the speed limit in most places. I aimed to stop for a moment at a place called Saskatchewan River Crossing that is about 160 kilometers away. This place is only open during the summertime and has a hotel, restaurant, gas station, store, and level 2 chargers. Of course, during this time of the year, the place is completely shut down. I have arrived in Saskatchewan River Crossing, and let's check the numbers. The battery is at 54% and 2.2 degrees. This means the heat produced from the battery discharge just maintained the battery temperature we started with. This is not surprising since I was driving kind of slowly and carefully, using less energy and producing less heat. The coolant is at minus 8, the ambient temperature is minus 15. I'm happy to report that the consumption is 5.3 kilometers per kilowatt hour, which is much better than what we needed to go to field, and that is 4.5. We have 80 kilometers more to go before we arrive in field, and as long as we can keep the consumption around 5.3, we should have no problems arriving there. The last 80 kilometers is actually where the driving got even more difficult. The snowfall is extremely heavy. The snow layer on the road became thicker and thicker, and visibility became worse and worse. There was so much snow piled up on the side of the road that there was barely enough room for two vehicles to move past each other. There are uphill sections where the snow is so thick that if I did not maintain momentum, the wheels would slip and the vehicle would slide down backwards. So much snow was kicked up by the vehicle that they stuck to the rear and blocked the rear windshield. The windshield wiper couldn't keep up and eventually got stuck. As there was nowhere to park and clean it up, I had to rely on the wing mirrors and I kept going. After this tremendously tough drive, I finally reached the end of Highway 93 and was able to drive on the much cleaner Highway 1. I will turn on the audio here so you can hear my elations of joy as I exited Highway 93. It's Highway 1. Yes. Knowing that I definitely had enough energy to reach field, I proceeded there. It's another 20 kilometers. But on Highway 1, I hit a patch of very low visibility. All the vehicles on the road turned on their hazard lights and began driving slowly. The speed was around 30 kilometers per hour, so it took a while to get to field. I arrived in field with 20% battery at 5.7 degrees. The ambient temperature is -10, and this is when I just plugged in, so the coolant had already started to heat up. 5.7 degrees of battery temperature is just short of the critical temperature of 6 degrees where we can get 40 kilowatts of charging speed. And in a moment, you will see that it didn't take long to achieve a decent speed. I want to show you the rear of the vehicle. As you can see, it is completely covered and the wiper is stuck. This is the BC Hydro charging station in field. It has one 50 kilowatt DC fast charger and one level 2 charger. Here is the time lapse of the charging session, and of course, it's sped up just like any other time lapse. The charging session started with 24 kilowatts as reported by the vehicle. The net power is 21 kilowatts because the heater is pulling 2 to 3 kilowatts. As soon as the battery reached the critical temperature around 6 degrees, the charging speed jumped up to 42 kilowatts. The net power is 39 because again, the battery heater is still on. Once the battery reaches the next critical temperature around 15 degrees, in this case it's actually 17 degrees, the battery heater shuts off and the charging speed jumps to 46 kilowatts. The net charging speed, as reported by the OBD display, is 45 kilowatts, a lot closer to the gross charging speed now, since the battery heater is no longer active. I stopped charging at 64% battery. The whole charging session was 50 minutes. I spent that time cleaning up the snow and ate a bit of a late lunch. Now I'm ready to go to Canmore. The Petro-Can charging stations were reported to be offline for some time. So looks like they're not Petro-Can, they're Petro-Cant. So yeah. But looks like on that day, they may have come back online. So I wanted to go and check to see if they're working. If they're working, I will make a successful check-in on PlugShare. And if they are still offline, if they are Petro-Cant, then Canmore has electrified Canada as well as flow chargers, so there are a lot of choices in Canmore. The drive to Canmore from field was uneventful. The visibility is better now. At the same time, it is starting to get dark, and I'm happy I plan to get out of Highway 93 with plenty of daylight. I arrived in Canmore with 37% battery at 8.8 degrees. The coolant is at -4. And the ambient temperature is 17 degrees. And the distance is just over 100 kilometers with a consumption of 5.6 kilometers per kilowatt hour. It looks like I have arrived with too much battery again. These Petro-Canada chargers can go up to 350 kilowatts, which means under ideal conditions, the Kona can charge up to 75 kilowatts when plugged into one of these. However, In order to reach that charging speed, the charging session must start at a low state of charge. The Kona has to be around 20% battery or less in order for the charging session to get to 75 kilowatts. So for this session, I'm expecting a charging speed of around 50 kilowatts. Here is another view of the front-facing charge port full of snow under the outer cover. Again, just clean it up a bit before taking the inner cover off. Thankfully, the charger is working. The charging session is very similar to the other ones. We start with 42 kilowatts, and the battery heater raises the battery temperature to around 15, and then we get around 46 kilowatts. I stopped charging at 56% because we have more than enough to get to Calgary. The charging session was 20 minutes. It was another 100 kilometers to Calgary, and this time the speed limit is 110 kilometers per hour. I used the cabin heating quite liberally, and I arrived in Calgary with 18% battery. The total distance driven today was 475 kilometers with an average consumption of 5.1 kilometers per kilowatt hour. I would say this is a pretty good consumption number considering the challenging weather conditions. Thank you for sticking around and watching this long video on how battery temperature affects the Kona's performance in this Canadian winter. So what did we learn? The Kona Electric does not seem to mind the battery being cold. As you saw, there is almost no battery heating when the vehicle is not plugged in, which allows for the battery to drop to minus 25 degrees, even when winter mode is actually on. The downside of the Kona's thermal management system is that with such a cold battery, you are going to charge slowly when plugged into a DC fast charger until the battery warms up. This will increase your charging time. To counteract this, try to start with a full charge before going on long trips in the winter so that you can drive further and allow the battery to passively warm up before plugging in. This will minimize heating that is required. The upside of the Kona's thermal management system is that the vehicle will not waste any energy trying to keep the battery warm while being parked outside in the cold. Many other types of EVs keep the battery at a higher temperature by using the energy inside the battery or by pulling energy from the charger. The Kona seems to want to conserve energy as much as possible. In an adverse situation, where charging is not available, the Kona will be able to conserve energy while other EVs slowly sip power out of the battery to maintain a higher battery temperature. I find the Kona's battery temperature requirement to be forgiving in these cold climates. The battery only needs to reach 6 degrees before you can get a decent charging speed. Many EVs require much higher temperature threshold before getting to a good charging speed. Of course, these findings apply to the Kona Electric, but I think they are also valid for the second generation Kia e-Soul or the Kia e-Niro, since all of these vehicles are based on the same platform, and I believe they will perform similarly under the same conditions. Here at Ready Steady Charge, we want to test as many vehicles as we can in these winter conditions. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure you give us a big thumbs up if you like what you're seeing. Make sure you subscribe for more electric vehicle content in this Canadian cold. My name is Solomon, and we'll see you on the next one.